Hello, I'm Bertram de Souza, veteran Mahoney Valley journalist and host of the Scribbler podcast that's streamed on my YouTube channel and posted on the Scribbler Facebook page. Today, we continue our conversation about this year's political sweepstakes. Early voting has begun for the November 5 general election, and all eyes nationally are on the crucial presidential contest. Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Kamala Harris are offering the American people two very different visions of this nation's future. President Trump's vision is shrouded in darkness, while Vice President Harris has cast hers in lightness. And yet, if the polls are to be believed, neither candidate has been able to win over a majority of the electorate. The race for the presidency is a toss-up. In Ohio, the U.S. Senate battle featuring longtime incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown and his Republican challenger, businessman Bernie Moreno, is also going down to the wire. There is also the highly contentious gerrymandering issue that has been the target of Republican dirty tricks. So, what should we make of all this? To answer that question, I've invited three prominent political analysts who have appeared several times on this podcast. Dr. William Binning is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Youngstown State University and a former Ohio Republican Party insider. Brent Larkin is Dean of Political Writers in Ohio and the retired editorial page director of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Larkin continues to write a Sunday column for the newspaper and its website, cleveland.com. Dr. Tom Suddis, an instructor at Ohio University, is a former political writer for the Plain Dealer. Suddis also writes a column for the newspaper and its website. Gentlemen, again, thank you for joining us. Because it's going to be long, I think, given all of the issues we want to cover, since this is the last time we're going to be together, before the election, we'll break it up into two segments. The first segment will focus on the presidential election. And then the second segment will focus on the U.S. Senate race in Ohio and the gerrymandering issue.
Issue one,
because there's a lot of, I'm getting emails from people asking, what does this all mean?
Exactly.
And I think that's going to be, so we'll discuss that. So if you're ready, so once again, thank you, Bill, Brent, and Tom, for bringing some sanity to this insane political season. It truly is. So let me start with this overarching question. And Bill, I'll let you go first, and then Brent and Tom. Can you recall a time during your long involvement in politics when lying, hypocrisy, racism, denigration of women, and even the demonization of democracy were accepted as legitimate political speech? Bill?
But no, I think we've been evolving to that, but this is, we're at the bottom or the peak of that use of that kind of politics. I think to me, right now, I think the most interesting thing about this presidential election is how close it is. I can't imagine. Of course, the pollsters and everybody could be wrong, but I can't imagine how we're gonna know on Wednesday who won this presidential election, and when the parties. Of course, Trump has never agreed to that he lost the last election, but when the parties actually settle, I mean, I think that what's really unusual, what could be really unique about this election and troubling in many ways is how close the outcome might be if we take the prognosticators or pollsters or all those seers that make these predictions. Because if it's in these 7 or 8 battleground states, and all of them are a margin of fractions, not even 5%, a fraction, half a percentage or something. It's hard to see how because somebody might pull out. I don't mean to take up any time, but the Raging Cajun says a couple of weeks ago, he predicted somebody will pull out. Somebody would actually start to have momentum and
you mean separate themselves from the race?
Yeah. He didn't say who. He just said he thought one of them, but we don't see that yet. And I think that's really to me, as political science, that's what's really the character or the significant characteristic of this race.
And we'll pursue that line, but as a political scientist, I mean, hard-hitting campaigns are not new. I mean, that's a tradition of American politics. But for some reason, this to me, this year seems to have a different tone to it. Is that what you hear, Bill, as well?
I think we live in an era, a era of politics where there's a really sharp divide between the protagonists, between the contestants, between the parties, and that the distance between them is enormous. And so they're both of them very confrontational. And as you pointed out, willing to say anything to try to gain an advantage. So I think you have to think of it in that way, that we're in an era of politics, and in many of the elections that are being held, like for Brown's seat, and that they take on that same aura, that same
Right.
that nastiness, amount of money. It's I think that's why I think about it. I think about it that we're in an era of politics. I mean, if you go back in the history of politics or campaigns, you go through different periods where there's in some cases that one party is so dominant there's not even significant a contest, and sometimes the parties are very agreeable, and there's not much difference between them. But we're in a particularly, when this is written about for a textbook, it's going to be a different era and have these characteristics that you speak of.
Brent, your observations, please.
This has been the way presidential elections, they have been especially close since 2008. 2008 was the last race that was not close. There were questions about whether or not Obama would be reelected all the way up until the night of the election. But we are in an era now where this amounts to hand-to-hand combat in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Milwaukee to determine who the next president is. And that's what it may come down to, literally that, 5 or 10,000 people in those two cities who, but your question also spoke to the tone, Bertram, and I think Trump has a rally planned for Madison Square Garden sometime in the next 2 weeks that is being compared, perhaps rightly so, to the Nazi rally there in, was it 38 or 39? Tom would know.
I think 38.
Okay. And I went back and watched clips of that, and it wasn't all that similar to some of the stuff Trump is saying, but there were similarities, and people were all roused up about, running these people out of the country and putting them in internment camps. And if that is indeed where we are heading, and we would all agree it is at least remotely possible, then this country, we're not at the beginning of the end. We might be at the end of the beginning of the end.
And Tom, you're also a political scientist. Give us your perspective of the presidential election.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm a scientist or anything, but I make 3 observations. The first is that I agree that the tone and the general conduct, especially of the one candidate, is unprecedented. I think I could see echoes of it, though, in parts of the Wallace campaign in '68, when be it noted he appeared at Stanton Auditorium, I believe. My late mother went to demonstrate against him, I believe, at that time. The second thing is, I think that there are divisions in the Republican Party. They aren't as obvious because of the kowtowing to the nominee, but I think this goes back to what I would call, goes back to the Civil War in the GOP, since I think the Ford-Reagan contest of 1976 between the two factions of the party, which have evolved over the years, but in some respects, the differences are still there about extreme social conservatism and more pragmatic Eisenhower-era politics. And the third thing is, and I think this is something that Brett and I, particularly because of our working backgrounds, are aware of, is I guess I call the decentralization of media. There was a time when, and I'm not saying it was good or bad, when mass media in this country, especially the major newspapers, the gigantic ones and the gigantic networks, kind of set the agenda.
Right.
What was acceptable and what was not acceptable by candidates in terms of what they said and how they acted. And now the diffusion, and this applies to all kinds of realms of American life, the diffusion of media has meant that there is kind of anarchy out there, basically, about messaging. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's democracy, certainly. And maybe the old system was restrictive of free expression. But I think we have a Wild West show, so to speak, out there right now. And I think it's doesn't serve any of us very well. But I'm not sure we can expect any change anytime soon either. I mean, when you have people threatening emergency workers in North Carolina over, I mean, it's all basically madness. So I think that in many respects it is unprecedented. I also should add, as a side thing, that I think it's interesting that supposedly right now, one of the issues that's featuring in some Ohio campaigns is the whole issue of transgendered people. I say that not because I'm mocking them. I think I feel strongly that people should be treated with total justice and empathy. Right. But it is such a relatively small phenomenon in terms of populations that to see people get agitated over picking on somebody, picking on people that are a tiny minority of the country is rather telling about the level of acrimony out there and the level of anger and hatred people seem to have stored up about all kinds of things. And that's dangerous.
So Bill alluded to this. And so, Brent, if you would take it, with just 20 days to the election,
yeah,
the race is a toss-up, of course. Did you expect it to be so close when Vice President Kamala Harris replaced President Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee? And how do you explain the closeness of the race? Brent, if you want to go, and then Tom, and then Bill.
Well, the answer to part A is no. And I think few people expected this to be this close because it was becoming, it had become so apparent that Biden was going to lose, and probably by a sizable margin. But she, in many ways, maybe not all, has kind of risen to the task. And it was always going to be close because no matter who his opponent was, the Democratic nominee was going to be running against the most unpopular president in our lifetime. And clearly, for many good reasons, wildly unpopular man. He's underwater by 15 points maybe? So I guess it was always going to be close because there are enough people with common sense enough to realize what a dangerous guy he is.
Tom?
I agree with what Brent said pretty much down the line. The only thing I would add is, and this may sound PC, and I don't care if it does or not, but I think in one sense, the vice president has a tremendous advantage in being a woman and speaking to, and also being much younger, that's another problem of our geriatric political class in Washington. But on the other hand, I still think that there's a kind of an embedded, I have to say, sexism in the minds, however buried in some people, that somehow think that having a woman at the head of the government is just not an effective message about us, even though we see over the years Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, all these tremendously strong women in public life in other nations. I think that's part of it. I will say this, and again, I'm not in a metropolitan area or anything, and of course, this area is also it's atypical in all kinds of ways. But I do sense from the moment that the vice president announced that she was going to run, big surprise, but in lieu of Biden, I do think I saw or suspected or felt a surge of enthusiasm and excitement, which absolutely was lacking totally with Joe Biden. So in a way, we forget how much she had to make up to close that gap between where Biden was and where she is now. And that's pretty tremendous accomplishment, I think. Now, that doesn't mean she's going to win, but I think it just shows the thirst the public had for something better and something more forward-looking. But I also want to add to what Brent said a few minutes ago. I think we're going to see an election that's going to be decided in a few counties or townships around Philadelphia, for example, maybe Milwaukee or Madison or wherever, and Phoenix. And it could be, given the history, especially of Arizona's crazy people in political life, it could be a very long week, not just election night, to see what happens.
Yeah, I think so.
Bill?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So give us your thoughts about when Kamala Harris took over as the nominee. What were your thoughts as to how she was going to do against Donald Trump, given the time frame, number one? And are you surprised about the closeness of this race?
The first question is, I thought that the election it went so well for her. She was so well received by the Democrats. She was so well received, and she had a good convention, and it just seemed like everything was going in her direction. She had a lot of momentum. She was, any polling that was done, she was ahead of Trump, and I thought, I don't know why it's turned out the way it is, but at the beginning, everything broke her way and the Democrats' way. I'd say for the first couple of weeks, first month or so after she. I think people were so relieved. There was so much discontent over the choice of the two candidates, because you get these two 80-year-old men that've been around forever, and people were, and they were so delighted that they had something fresh and new and different, and as Tom pointed out. So yeah, that's how it started. She had a great beginning in this election, and they asked me why. I thought that's the way it was going to end up. I didn't know that we come to the point we're at now. I mean, the election is close in certain places.
Yeah,
Right.
It's not. I mean, it's not close in California or New York or Vermont or
Ohio
or Mississippi. It's not close in those places. It's just a handful of states, probably mostly, I don't know, difference between these suburban and rural areas, et cetera, and a lot of huge gender gap and all this. And so I can't. It's just a phenomena of our times. This freakish closeness of the race, which we may say we were wrong. Maybe in a week it will break and go away. Something will happen, not an event, but maybe the public will move. Say, oh, it's enough. We don't know. We're talking about an election like it's like we're predicting that's the way it's going to end. That's because that's what the last polls show us, but we don't know that's the way it's going to end for sure. It just looks that way right now. It's very close. This closeness, unbelievable. I mean, the closest, unbelievable.
We have these two candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, offering two very different visions of America's future. One shrouded in darkness, which is Trump, and he's proud of that. And the other is trying to, sort of offer lightness. And yet, there's only a sliver of the electorate that remains undecided. Tom, when political observers and political scientists try to talk about the undecided, I'm reminded of what George Will used to say about if it's this late in an election and you haven't decided, then perhaps you shouldn't be voting because you haven't given enough thought to the issues and what else is going on. So could you talk about the undecided vote, Tom?
I don't believe there are any people that are really undecided. I think they say that because they want to appear open-minded or neutral. I think everybody has a preponderance, one way or the other. It's just 1% toward a certain viewpoint. I will say this: I do think if someone is truly undecided, they're trying to make a wager in their mind about two things. And so I'm not being flippant about what I said earlier, but I think there are real questions, even if you are a fan of his, which I guess some people are, whether Donald Trump has the physical and mental capacity to serve in the White House as president. Now, that was true before, but now it's becoming more pronounced. Right. And I think that's just a fact. I don't think it's a partisan statement. The other thing is, I think that we as a country, as a people, are rightly concerned about international developments right now, especially in the Near East. And I think there is probably a balancing act in people's minds between whether or not, if Mr. Trump comes back to office, he'd be in a better position to, I'd say, keep us out of war, which we're going to be in anyway, frankly, or she would be better positioned to do that. But in general, I'm very skeptical of people that say they're undecided. I think that's kind of just a way of being tactful and seeing what you think when I say back to you. Because I don't know what I can understand someone being totally committed to Trump and someone being committed to Ms. Harris, but I just don't see, I'm going to decide you got to pay your money eventually and buy the product, right, one or the other.
Brent, do you think there is an undecided sliver, or are these people telling pollsters that?
Well, I think there's always some people going to say that, but I think one thing that happens about that, by the way, is not this group here, but people in general focusing too much on the whole question of popular vote, because it may come down to this is an election will be decided truly by the Electoral College, whatever the popular vote happens to be. I mean, that is to say that Harris could win with the minority of the popular vote, and Trump could too. So that's another factor in this mix.
Hey, Brent,
But yeah, well,
what's your view of the undecided? Because that seems to be the focus of everyone when they're discussing this election. Is there an undecided vote, or are these people just, not wanting to show their hand?
I don't know. It would just be a guess. But Bill, I think Bill mentioned a couple minutes ago that it's almost unbelievably close.
Yeah.
And I heard it. Was listening to a podcast with David Plouffe, and if Harris wins, he may be one of the unsung heroes in this thing.
Yes.
And he said it is literally tied. Are they undecided? Is it a matter of convincing the persuadables right now, or is it a matter of making sure you figure out a way to get your people to vote? And it's probably more of the latter.
Yeah.
The real short version of this story. In 2008, on Election Day, my grandson was 14, 15 months old. And I remember 2008, it was a bright, sunny day in Cleveland, and pushing it, and they lived in a very integrated neighborhood at the time. And these vans pulling into driveways and pretty much taking these people out of their homes and putting them in, I'm exaggerating a bit here, stuffing them into the vans to drive them to Monticello Boulevard School to vote. Well, we all know who they were voting for. Some Democratic operatives have proven to be pretty damn effective at getting people to the polls on Election Day, and it may come down to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, Brent, I know a poll worker in my precinct who's been there many, 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 many years, and in 2008, he was telling me that, and these were not young voters; these were older voters.
Yeah.
For the first time he ever saw them, and he says, he was surprised that these people, he had never seen them before voting in that precinct, and all of a sudden they were long lines. And you're right. And so, Bill, that means turnout is going to be key, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And so, in your estimation, where does the enthusiasm lie right now? In which camp, the Trump camp or the Harris camp?
Well, I think that's pretty hard to answer that question. But I mean, in the last couple of weeks, it seemed like the momentum has shifted towards Trump. It's Trump that's gained in these polls, but the gains has just been fractional percentages that brought this appear to be a tied race. And I don't know if I think Trump has a ceiling for his vote and his support. And so I don't think even if he's had momentum that it's the kind of candidate or the kind of campaign that it's going to keep going on. I think going back to the idea of the undecided,
right.
I agree with Brett and Tom on it. I don't know that there is, but we used to say in polling, I was thinking about this. We used to say when we did polling that the undecided broke against the incumbent. But the difficulty with using an old adage like that today is I'm thinking, well, who's the incumbent in this race?
Exactly.
For a while, as we pointed out, Harris looked like the fresh newcomer, the challenger, et cetera. And some of that seemed to have worn off. But to go to your point, yeah, turnout, and there's increasing stories. I'm sure you all read them in the New York Times and other places where they talk about the different approach to turnout that these two camps. There's a lot of criticism of the Trump turnout, if there even is a organized effort to have a Trump turnout. As Brett pointed out, they use the old Obama people to create a more standardized turnout operation to get people out to vote. So I don't know. I think people are going to vote, or there's intensity among supporters in both camps. So I think the supporters are going to vote. I don't know where other people. If you're undecided, and she said, "I don't like either one of these people,"
Right.
I'm not voting,
Yeah.
or I'm going to vote for the Green candidate or the Libertarian candidate. I don't have a good choice here, because to go back to, I don't want to change the subject, but go back to Tom's point about the division in the Republican Party. What's disconcerting to me is there is no voice in any place about the budget, about Social Security. I mean, neither one of them talk about any issues that really matter going forward, in my opinion. And I think that's another, so it's kind of like, well, geez, if that's what you really are concerned about, why would you go for either one of these people? Who's going to be the biggest disaster for the budget?
Exactly. We're still on the presidency, but let me approach it from this way. We cannot ignore the role that Senator J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, is playing in what I consider to be the disintegration of American politics. Indeed, Vance has admitted that he lies in order to grab media attention. The lie about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, eating pet cats and dogs, the lie about FEMA, diverting money away from natural disasters to support illegal immigrants. And yet, Vance could be a heartbeat away from the presidency. Do we have reason to worry about this man, Brent?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think so, because I think he's more dangerous than Trump because he's more serious and he's clearly a lot smarter.
Yeah.
He's younger. He's more articulate. He's many things that Trump is not, and he's a much more dangerous version because he might be, serious about some of this stuff. And I don't want him to be our vice president, because there is actuarial charts will tell you that there's probably a 50% chance. Look at Trump; he's 100 pounds overweight. That there's a good chance that he would be president. Yeah,
Right.
So yes, I do worry about it. There's reason to worry about it.
Tom, you in previous conversations have sort of talked about how you had spent some time with him, talking to him.
A little bit, yeah.
And then you felt, you were not as harshly critical as some others have been. Given J.D. Vance's recent behavior, and for example, now his contention that the 2020 election was in fact stolen from Donald Trump, what's happening here to the person that you knew when you sat down with him and talked to him at length and came away with some impressions about him?
Well, first of all, he wouldn't be as smart as he is unless he realized that if Trump wins, the presidency is in J.D. Vance's grasp down the road at some point, very likely, and maybe in midterm, number one. And that kind of ambition, that kind of prospect of winning the lottery, so to speak, and make people do all kinds of things they otherwise wouldn't do. I would never discount his intelligence. And the thing that's a little bit concerning, besides everything else, is the fact that if you meet him, in my opinion, he's extremely presentable and mannerly and all the rest of it, all the things that Trump is not. But if you look at his messaging and what he says, it's basically Trumpian. I want to say one last thing, and I think Brent has felt the same way, written about it. Few things I've seen or heard, especially in Ohio politics, but in general, is more disgusting than the Springfield Haitian thing.
Right.
Mhm.
I just, that's all I can, anything I say will be redundant.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just one of the lowest things I've ever seen in Ohio, in any politics. I think it was just beyond the pale. And if I can dare say so, for someone who professes himself to be a follower of Christianity,
Yes.
it's simply contradictory. It makes no sense. I mean, it's wrong. It's totally wrong. And you can cite chapter and verse, so to speak, about that. And and I have to say that this was, and that's why, and Brett talked to David Hobson, for example, was so telling about someone who knew the town and lived there and was a Republican as well, et cetera. That Vance has a lot to answer for in terms of history's judgment for things like that, for condemning these people, the refugees.
But and that what disturbs me. But before I do that, say anything about that, I want the viewers to know that you and Brent both wrote very hard-hitting columns about about the Springfield situation. And I would urge people to go and to read those because they really so. But you know what? What's even more egregious about Vance's attack on immigrants is the fact that his wife is a South Asian Indian whose parents immigrated to America from India. And he has mixed race children.
Right.
And then also claims that he found his way through Roman Catholicism, which,
are the same Dominicans that had me at St. Dominic's on the South Side.
Yeah, and so, let's talk to a good Roman Catholic, Bill Binning. How Christian is it for somebody like a J.D. Vance who knows better? Perhaps Donald Trump doesn't. Perhaps he grew up with this arrogance of inherited wealth, and so he knows no better about the real world. But J.D. Vance does. So, Bill,
I think that too. He's an enigmatic character. I can't really figure him out. You have to wonder, somebody with obvious intelligence, what kind of character he has that he feels compelled to lie so much about significant things, like who won the last election. I mean, that had to be tremendously embarrassing, because he certainly knows better. But to lie, have to continually lie like that, and also this Haitian thing, make something up like that. Although I don't know what the roots of it all were, but certainly it was a big, as Thompson, beyond the pale. But I think there's another point. So that's my concern. When I see him or I hear him, I wonder about this. How does this guy live with that? How can a guy who, he wrote a book of a tough life, and he went to college, and he's a big success, and all this stuff. How can a guy get up there and lie to the entire country about these things? It's hard to figure out what's twisting in his soul for that to go on, to be that ambitious, that you would do that. But that go to another point that Tom hinted on, but he didn't follow it up enough, and that is, it doesn't matter whether they win or not. J.D. Vance is potentially the future of the Republican Party, one way or another. And he will continue the Trump tradition, even if I don't know that the old guard, the Cheneys, and that crowd can make a comeback at him. I mean, it's going to be a tremendous amount of friction, but he's going to be a leader of a fraction. Arguably, he'll have the same level of support in the primary that Trump has, which is about less than half of the support of the Republicans, but enough to win, because there'll be more than one candidate. So I think that's another interesting point, though, that he is, win or lose, I think, the potential future of the Republican Party.
Yes.